Well, another very warm welcome back to your number one and favourite vintage race bike internet channel, Classic Dirt Bike TV, and thanks of course to all the brand new subscribers who have recently signed up to my channel. I think we have at least another 30 or so new subscribers since my last video posting, so it's good to know that I'm doing something right and you're enjoying my content here on Classic Dirt Bike TV. Now, coming up next, this is a bike that may be not too familiar to many of you out there, but this is a bike from a long lost past from back in the day, and it's said that only 6 of these bikes were actually commissioned to be made, but I think only 2 were actually built. So I hope you enjoy this next video posting as we take a look at this Merlyn John Banks 500 Honda. Now, this quite nice looking John Banks Motorcycles Honda is yet another vintage off-road gem that's taken pride of place among Rob Hughes' 30 or so other vintage dirt bike timepieces, and it still amazes me to the kind of quality and extremely rare bikes that some of these collectors continue to have tucked away in the darkest corners of their workshops. Now, the story of this particular specimen really dates back to around 1977 when the legendary British rider John Banks left CCM after many successful years of racing as a works rider for the Alan Clues Bolton-based company. Now, John Banks always had a hankering to develop a 4-stroke motocross machine of his own, and it's said that not long after his departure from CCM, John Banks then approached one of his contacts who worked at the Colchester Racing Developments Engineering Company to ask if they would be interested in building a special motocross motorcycle just for him. Now, CRD's main source of manufacture was actually building the hugely successful Merlyn Formula 3 single-seater racing cars, which they had been supplying to car race drivers since the early 1960s. Now, designing and constructing a motocross motorcycle chassis would of course be a brand new venture for CRD, but nonetheless a very challenging one, and with John Banks's input and experience in the field, this could turn out to be a very interesting partnership indeed. Now, before I started the feature on this machine, trying to research and find out more information about this bike was just like pulling teeth, because there just didn't seem to be anybody with any background on its existence, parts, or its construction. So there was really only one thing to do, and that was to try and get in touch with the actual rider himself, the great John Banks. Now, although John wasn't available to speak to me at the time of contact, his daughter Melanie very kindly passed on my questions to John, and he dictated the answers in return. Now, although, as Melanie told me, this particular part of her father's life was quite some time ago, and John couldn't remember every single detail of his time with the bike, but nevertheless, the small pieces of data that I received from the family were still very valuable, and it certainly helped me out on 1 or 2 details. Now, as you'd expect, this is an extremely rare piece of motocross history, and it's not surprising that very little is actually known about this bike, as it's said that only 2 of these motorcycles were ever put together, and apparently only 1 was actually finished and ready to race, and the year of their manufacture is thought to be around 1978 or 79. Now, John told me that the actual bike that he raced constantly kept breaking gearboxes, and he only rode that particular bike a few times, and it's not entirely clear as to which of the 2 machines that we're looking at here in these video clips as our featured bike could possibly be the second bike that wasn't completed at the factory, because John thinks that someone at Merlyn found all of the bike's parts in boxes and then rebuilt the second bike years later. Now, starting with the bike's frame, this was built from chrome moly steel, and it had two single narrow cross tubes that ran across the top of the chassis that acted as its backbone, which was somewhat different from the conventional single tube configuration on other motocrossers. Now, John Banks, as you know, was a very hard taskmaster when it came to getting what he wanted, and if things weren't just so and correct, he certainly didn't want to incur his displeasure and get on the wrong side of him when he wasn't happy about certain aspects of his race bike designs. So this new chassis certainly had to be spot on and perfect from day one. Although after much deliberation and calculation, the completed chassis certainly turned out to be a work of art in terms of its design and quality of construction, and it certainly looked like the real deal when it was all painted in white and ready for its brand new Honda power plant. Now, the bike's engine was based around the hugely successful and reliable Honda XL350 four-stroke engine, although because this bike is now listed as a 500, John told me that major machining on these engines did take place and the cylinders were bored out to up the cubic capacity from the stock 350 to 500 cc. Now, this again, he said, it turned out to be another chink in the engine's armour. As John said, the bored out Honda motor he thinks was just far too powerful for the 350 5-speed gearboxes, and he thinks that that's the actual reason that the gearboxes were so unreliable. But these were still factory Honda engines with magnesium casings and titanium fixings, so they were certainly top of the range and quite exotic for their time. Now again, the engine's exhaust system is once more a Merlyn factory designed part with a straight through big bore exhaust pipe, which is a single piece unit that's fixed at the exhaust header and then supported at the rear by a simple hanger bolt that's bolted onto the chassis and then of course onto the rear tailpipe. But you can only imagine what kind of brap comes out of this big megaphone tailpipe when that huge 500 Honda engine gets fired into life. Now, with regards to the front forks on this bike, as far as I'm aware, these are just beefed up Honda items using, of course, drum brake hubs, and these are all bolted together using heavy duty spokes onto these factory DID alloy wheels. And once again, because this was the 1970s, many manufacturers were still using these old drum brake systems, which were still adequate for slowing down this relatively light John Banks 500. Now, once more, the rear suspension units again are top quality Öhlins remote gas shocks, and I think these shocks have undergone a full refurbishment before being fitted back onto this bike. But even for an older twin shock motocrosser, these remote Öhlins suspension units would have been top of the range for their day, and naturally would have had to be the very best if John Banks was going to race this bike on the track. Now again, at first glance, the bike's coverings of the tank and side panels look just like any other off-roader, although in fact these featured parts are just one single GRP unit, and the actual fuel tank itself is a much smaller self-contained aluminium cell that is bolted underneath the two frame rails that run along the top of the chassis. And as you can see here, the bike's fuel tank is very small in comparison to the tank's cover, so you'd certainly have to get your calculations absolutely spot on to make sure that you had enough gas in the tank to cover a full GP moto race, because these big exotic 500 Honda motors certainly liked a drink. Now the Merlyn Honda's seat again is simply fixed to those GRP panels and is part of the kind of structure that you'd sometimes see on many of the trials bikes of the 1970s and 80s with their integrated tank, side panels and seat. Now the steel constructed rear swing arm is again a bespoke Merlyn design, and rather than have the swing arm mountings inside the rear of the chassis in the conventional manner, this unit is bolted onto the outside of the chassis as per many of the British made Shenny frames were back in the day. But it's a fine piece of engineering, that's for sure, and a part that was very strong and could stand up to a lot of rough track pounding. Now, keeping up with all the other brand new design features on this Merlyn 500 John Banks Honda, it has its own design of handlebars, and these were more than likely made to John Banks's own specifications, and again these were made of steel with this V-shaped racing bar across the top, and for me personally a much better design than the modern day Renthal type bars that are now such a common fitment on almost all off-roaders in this modern day. Now, as far as I'm aware, all of the bike's controls and cables and levers and grips are all period correct for this John Banks Honda, and this Swedish made Gunnar Gasser throttle had a very tough job to control the many horses that 500 Honda 4-banger motor was putting out. Although in terms of what they were actually like to ride on the track, these were pretty good handling bikes, John told me, and he said the chassis was light and very strong, and John also said he even won a race on one of these bikes the very first time that he took it to the track during a televised motocross event that was broadcast live on TV, which he thinks was around the early 1980s. But at the end of the day, this Merlyn Banks partnership appeared to have all the makings of what could have been another great British made motocross machine, although Merlyn's bread and butter workload was always manufacturing racing motor cars and not off-road motorcycles. And although building a couple of prototypes was still pretty much child's play for such a talented engineering company, when it came to producing motorbikes on a larger scale, that was of course another story. Now, if Merlyn did decide to mass produce these off-road Hondas on a much larger scale, that would surely have impacted on the production of their more lucrative car racing franchise, which of course was far more important to the balance sheets of the company. And so the once great vision and partnership between John Banks and Merlyn Motor Cars was then dissolved. Now, soon after the brief partnership with Merlyn was finished, John Banks then returned to CCM as a works rider once again, because at the end of the day he was a motocross racer as a day job, and that was where John made his money and what he did for a living, and he also had bills to pay like everybody else, although sometime later, as you know, John would go on to develop and market his very own and hugely successful JBR Honda bikes using that superb 500 Honda XR motor. Well, there you have it, another extremely rare bike from our motocross past that lovely Merlyn 500 John Banks Honda, a very rare machine indeed, and we're certainly privileged to be able to take a look at that bike, considering it's just one of only 2 bikes that survived. Okay, coming up in my next video posting, we're going to take a look at this lovely little RM125 Suzuki that I came across during my travels in the paddock in 2021. So when we return, we'll be taking a look at this Sean McCree's lovely RM125 Suzuki. But until then, of course, everybody out there in classic dirt bike land, please stay safe and well when you're out there riding those old vintage racers, and we'll get together again very soon to talk about more vintage iron right here on your #1 and favourite classic dirt bike TV channel.